Hello, my name is Valeria. This is my new original story on my channel. Subscribe and enjoy.
The Alpha King ordered her executed, then realized she was the only one who could save his dying son. She is dragged into the throne room in iron chains. No shoes, no cloak. Just a woman who made the mistake of being in the wrong place and knowing too much. The charges against her are read aloud in front of the entire court. Unauthorized contact with the royal heir, trespassing on crown lands, fleeing the scene of a royal emergency. She does not argue. She does not weep. She simply stands there in the torchlight with blood drying on her hands and looks at the king as though she expected this, as though she has been waiting for this moment for a very long time. The Alpha King looks at her for exactly 3 seconds. Then he gives the order. Execution. At dawn. The court applauds. And in the dungeon, as the guards push her through the iron door, and the lock turns behind her, she closes her eyes and thinks, 12 hours. She has 12 hours before everything falls apart. She is not wrong, because 11 hours later, the royal heir stops breathing, and every healer in the palace fails. Chapter 1. The woman they call a traitor. Mara had not always lived small. There was a time, years ago now, when she had occupied an entire wing of the Healers' Institute in the capital, when her name had carried weight in courts and councils, when lords sent their fastest riders to fetch her personally, not because she was available, but because she was the best. That time was over. Now she lived in a 2-room cottage at the edge of the Ashfin marshes, with a leaking roof and a garden of medicinal herbs that she tended before sunrise every morning, so that no one would see her and start asking questions. She was good at not being seen. She had been practicing for 10 years. The cottage suited her. The marsh suited her. The silence, the fog, the particular quality of light that fell through the reed beds in the early morning, soft and gray, and entirely indifferent to human ambition. All of it suited her perfectly. What did not suit her was the royal hunting party that thundered past her property line on a Tuesday evening in late autumn. 300 horses and twice as many hounds, flags flying and horns blowing, announcing their presence to every living creature within 5 miles. Mara put down her pruning knife and watched them pass from behind the hedge. She was not alarmed. The royal family hunted these lands every year. They always stayed to the eastern trail, well clear of the marsh. She went back to her herbs. Half an hour later, she heard the scream. It came from the direction of the deep forest, not the trail, and it was short and sharp, and then it stopped. She stood very still in her garden. Do not, she told herself firmly. You are not that person anymore. You made a choice. You live here now. You grow plants. You treat farmers for chest colds and broken bones, and you do not go near anything with a royal crest on it. The wind shifted, and on it, faint but unmistakable, came a scent that made every trained instinct in her body ignite at once. She was running before she finished the thought. She found him at the bottom of the ravine. A young man, perhaps 17 or 18, tall and broad in the way of born alphas, dressed in riding leathers with a gold crest on the collar. He had gone over the edge when his horse spooked at something. The animal was gone. The boy was not dead, but he was not far from it. Mira slid down the embankment on her heels and was on her knees beside him before the dirt stopped falling. She had 3 seconds to assess. Head wound, not the danger. Left arm, compound fracture. Bad, but manageable. Breath, shallow and wrong in a way that had nothing to do with the fall. She leaned down and smelled his skin, and her stomach dropped straight through the earth. Someone had poisoned this boy. Not today. Not from the fall. This had been in his system for days, possibly longer, working quietly and steadily toward his heart. Her hands moved without her permission, pulling open her satchel, the one she carried everywhere out of habit, and had cursed herself for 100 times for carrying. She had the antidote compound half assembled before she caught herself. Her hands stopped. She looked down at the gold crest on his collar. She looked at the unconscious face of this young man, who was dying in front of her, and thought about what it would mean to save him. They would ask how she knew. They would want to know who she was. They would find out. She thought about the life she had built, the cottage, the herbs, the silence. 10 years of invisible, careful survival. She looked at the boy. She uncorked the first vial and kept working. It took 40 minutes to stabilize him. She could not remove the poison entirely without the proper equipment. What she could do was slow its progress. Give him time. Perhaps another day or two before it reached a critical stage. She could hear horses in the distance. His people, searching. She leaned close to the boy's ear and said quietly and clearly, because she needed him to hear this, even half-conscious, "You have been poisoned. The compound is called gray seep. It mimics natural illness. Do not let them tell you. This is a riding accident. Find someone who knows what gray seep looks like and show them your blood. Do you understand me?" His eyelids fluttered. She had no way of knowing if he had heard. She gathered her satchel and left. She made it back to the cottage, changed her clothes, buried the used vials, and was boiling water for tea when the guards arrived. There were 12 of them. She did not run. Running would only have made things worse. Chapter 2. The King Who Cannot Afford to Be Wrong. Everyone in the kingdom knew 3 things about Alpha King Dorian. First, he was fair. Not kind, not warm, not the kind of ruler who sat at a common table and asked after your children by name, but fair. In Dorian's court, the law applied equally whether you were a duke or a stable hand, and everyone knew it. Second, he was effective. 12 years on the throne. 2 border wars ended by treaty rather than prolonged bloodshed. The kingdom's trade routes tripled. The treasury the healthiest it had been in 3 generations. He worked. He was relentless. He slept 4 hours a night, and used the other 20, as though each one had a task assigned. Third, he did not forgive. Not cruelty. Not incompetence. And absolutely not treachery. He had not forgiven himself for his wife. He had not forgiven the healer who served the court during Elena's final illness, and failed to save her. He had certainly not forgiven whatever woman had laid hands on his son in a ravine, and fled before she could be questioned. He sat at the head of the long table in the war room, and listened to his head of guard, Commander Voss, give the report. The boy, Prince Eaton, had been found at the bottom of the ravine by the search party. He was alive. He had been treated, clearly, by someone with medical knowledge, and that someone had disappeared. They found her 2 hours later based on the tracks leading back to the Marsh cottage. A woman, living alone. No pack affiliation registered. Called herself a herbalist. Name, Mara. Dorian said nothing for a moment. He looked at Eaton, who was sitting across the table from him wrapped in a blanket, pale but present, watching his father with eyes too careful for a boy who had just survived a fall. "Are you in pain?" Dorian asked him. "Some," Eaton said. "The healers here have examined you." "Yes? And?" Eaton hesitated for a fraction of a second. Dorian noticed it immediately. He noticed everything. "They say it is the effects of the fall," Eaton said. "Trauma. They want me to rest." Dorian looked at him for a long moment. Eaton looked back with those careful eyes. "Bring me the woman," Dorian said. The guards delivered Mara to the throne room that evening. Iron cuffs on her wrists, and 4 armed men around her. She walked in without being dragged, which was more composure than most managed under those circumstances. Dorian looked at her from the throne, and she looked back at him from the middle of the room, and neither of them moved for a moment. She was not what he expected. He had expected fear, or defiance, or the desperate brightness of someone who was about to start explaining themselves. She had none of those things. She had a quality of stillness that reminded him, with a jolt of something unpleasant, of his wife in her final weeks. The stillness of someone who had already accepted a difficult outcome and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. The charges were read. She said nothing. He asked her to explain herself. She said, "I would prefer not to answer questions here." It was said calmly, not arrogantly, as if it were a reasonable position. Something in the room shifted. He felt the attention of his court tighten. "You are in no position to have preferences," he said. "I understand," she said. "I still have them." He sentenced her at dawn. The court erupted in approval. She was taken below. Dorian returned to his chambers, sat at his desk, and stared at a document he was supposed to be reading for 20 minutes without reading it. He kept seeing her hands, not because they were soft or elegant. They were the opposite, scarred and capable, the hands of someone who had worked with them for years. But the way she had held them, at her sides in their chains, he had seen the discoloration on her right index finger, a faint rust-orange stain that never quite washed out. He knew that stain. His wife had called it healer's mark, the result of years working with a specific class of medicinal compound. Elena had pointed it out once on the hands of a woman she admired enormously, a healer of extraordinary skill who had trained under the great physicians of the southern academies. That woman had been called Mara. Dorian was still at his desk at midnight when the knock came. It was the royal physician, Aldrich, and his face was the color of old ash. "Your Majesty," Aldrich said. "The prince." Dorian was already on his feet. They had found Eaton collapsed on the floor of his chambers, breathing, but barely, his pulse erratic, his skin the wrong temperature, his eyes when they opened showing the whites. Every healer in the palace stood around the bed, looking at each other. Not one of them knew what they were looking at. Dorian stood in the doorway of his son's room and looked at the face of his only child, and felt the floor disappear beneath him. "What is wrong with him?" he said. His voice came out very quiet. Aldrich swallowed. "We are not entirely certain, Your Majesty. The symptoms are unusual, not typical of any injury sustained in a fall. We believe it may be an internal response, a kind of shock. But the specifics are—" "What do you need?" Dorian said. Aldrich said nothing, and in the silence, Dorian heard the answer. They did not know. They had nothing. They were standing around his dying son with expensive instruments and extensive educations, and they could not tell him what was happening or how to stop it. He turned and walked back down the corridor and called for Voss. "The woman in the dungeon," he said. "Bring her to me. If you want to know what Mara says to the king when he comes to her in the dungeon, do not go anywhere. This story is not finished. Hit the subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you do not miss what happens next. Because what she is about to tell Dorian will change everything he thought he knew. Chapter 3. What she has been carrying alone. The dungeon beneath the palace was not what most people imagined. It was cold, and it was dark, and the stone was damp, but it was not cruel. There were no instruments of suffering on the walls, no sounds of misery from other cells. Dorian had abolished certain practices when he took the throne. The dungeon was simply a place of waiting, and Mara could appreciate the distinction. She had spent the hours since her sentencing doing what she always did in difficult circumstances, assessing what she knew, organizing it, and deciding what to do with it. What she knew. Prince Eaton had been poisoned with grey seep, a compound of extraordinary rarity and equally extraordinary cruelty. It did not kill quickly. It worked in stages, mimicking natural illness until it reached the heart, and then it was catastrophic. She had slowed its progress. She had not stopped it. She had perhaps given him an extra day. That day was almost up. She also knew whoever had administered the grey seep had access to the prince. Close access. Grey seep had to be introduced through food or drink over a period of days, in small doses carefully calibrated to stay beneath the threshold of detection. This was not a stranger. This was someone who sat at the prince's table, stood in his room, poured his cup. And she knew one more thing. She had seen grey seep once before in her life, in a dead woman's blood. The sound of boots on stone came long before the guards appeared. Heavy, even footsteps. Not hurried. The walk of a man who was controlling himself very carefully. The door to her cell opened. Dorian stood in the doorway, without the throne room's ceremony around him, and looked considerably more dangerous without it. He was still in the clothes he had worn to court, minus the formal coat. He looked like a man who had not slept in several days, and was too far past exhaustion to feel it anymore. He looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped inside, and the guard closed the door. Mara did not stand. She remained seated on the stone bench, and looked up at him, and waited. "My son is dying," he said. "Yes," she said. "I know." Something moved across his face. There and gone. "You know what is wrong with him." "Yes." "Then tell me." She looked at him steadily. "Sit down, Your Majesty." He stared at her. No one told Dorian to sit down. No one. He sat. She watched him fold himself onto the opposite bench, this enormous man with his kingdom's future written in the lines of his face, and thought about how to say the next part. "The substance in your son's blood is called grey seep," she said. "It is not common. It is not easy to obtain. It is not the kind of thing that appears by accident." "Someone poisoned him deliberately," Dorian said. "Yes, and that person has been dosing him for at least 2 weeks, possibly longer. This began before the hunt. The fall simply accelerated the timeline." Dorian's jaw tightened. "You determined all of this in 40 minutes in a ravine." "I recognized it," she said. "I have seen it before." He waited. 7 years ago," she said, "I was the head physician at the Healers' Institute in the capital. The Queen, your wife, fell ill. Her personal healer was a man named Crest. When her condition began to worsen, Crest brought me in. He presented it as a consultation." She paused. It was not a consultation. He wanted me to confirm his diagnosis, which was a natural wasting illness. I looked at her blood, and I told him that his diagnosis was wrong. The silence in the cell was absolute. "I told him," she continued, keeping her voice flat and careful, that I believed I was looking at Grey Seep, that someone was poisoning the Queen. He told me I was incorrect. He told me to sign the documentation supporting his findings and say nothing further. When I refused, I was dismissed from the Institute within the week. My credentials were revoked. I was told that if I pursued the matter further, the consequences would be significant. Dorian had not moved. He sat perfectly still with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the floor. "Elena," he said. "Just the name. Just that." "She died 6 weeks later," Mara said quietly. "Of what the court was told was a natural deterioration of the blood. I read the official record from a village 200 miles away, and I knew what it meant. And I had no proof and no standing and no way to—" "Who?" Dorian said. His voice had changed. Something in it that had not been there before. "I do not know who ordered it," she said. "I only know who covered it. Crest signed every document. Crest controlled access to her chambers in those final weeks. But Crest could not have obtained the Grey Seep alone. It requires connections I do not believe he had." Dorian stood. He was very large in the small cell, and the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Mara stood as well, because she was not going to remain seated while having this conversation. "I can save your son," she said. "I need access to a properly equipped treatment room, and I need to begin immediately. Within the next few hours, the compound will reach a stage where even I cannot reverse it." He looked at her for a long time. "And in exchange," he said. "Not exchange," she said. "I will save him, because he is a child, and I will not let him die for someone else's politics. That is not a trade. That is simply what I am going to do." She held his gaze. "But when it is done, I am going to tell you everything I know about what happened to your wife. All of it. And you are going to have to decide what to do with it. That is the part that is not simple." He was quiet for so long that she thought he might refuse. Then he said, "What do you need?" She told him. He gave the orders himself, standing in the corridor outside her cell with Voss listening, and the guards scrambling. A treatment room. Specific equipment. A list of compounds. 12 items that needed to be located in the palace stores within the next 30 minutes. Mara walked beside him up the corridor without chains. He had not given an order to release her from her sentence. He had simply stopped treating her like a prisoner for the moment, and they both understood what that meant, and neither of them said it. Chapter 4. The treatment. What Dorian had expected. A dramatic procedure. What actually happened. A quiet woman working at a table for 4 hours without stopping. She did not ask him to leave. He did not offer to. He sat in the corner of the treatment room in a chair that was too small for him, and watched her work, and tried to remember the last time he had felt this helpless. She moved with an efficiency that was almost hypnotic, never reaching twice for the same thing, never pausing to think in a way that suggested uncertainty. She knew exactly what she was doing. Every motion was purposeful and precise. Eaton lay on the treatment bed, unconscious, his breathing shallow. "Talk to me," she said at one point without looking up. "About him. Tell me something about him." Dorian looked at his son's face. "Why?" "Because I need you to stay present and not disappear into your own thoughts. And talking helps." She still had not looked up. "And because he will feel it if you are here, even unconscious. The research is clear on this." He was quiet for a moment. "He argues with me about everything," Dorian said finally. "Every policy, every decision, every appointment. He is 17, and he believes he has opinions worth having. Does he? Sometimes. He is smarter than I was at his age. That must be convenient, she said. Something shifted in Dorian's chest. Not quite warmth. Something adjacent to it. He saved a village dog last winter, hid it in the palace for 6 weeks. The entire staff knew, and no one told me, because he had apparently won all of their loyalties through a combination of charm and bribery. He paused. I found out when it ate an important document. Mara made a sound that might have been a laugh, quiet and brief. He sounds like someone worth saving, she said. He is, Dorian said. She worked without speaking for another long stretch, and the room was full of the soft sounds of her instruments, and the fire, and Ethan's slow breathing. An hour in, she said, the poison was introduced through wine, his personal stock, not shared supply. Whoever administered it had access to his private chambers. The list of people with that access is short, Dorian said. I know. My head of household, 3 senior staff members, my chief advisor. Silence. His name is Lord Cavan, Dorian said. Yes. He looked at her. She continued working, but something in the set of her shoulders had changed. Cavan, Dorian said slowly, was also responsible for the Queen's household in the last year of her life. He took over those duties from the previous steward when the man retired. Yes, she said again. He was the one who recommended Crest as her personal healer. The room was very quiet. Why? Dorian said. Not loudly, not with anger, with something much more dangerous, which was absolute and total calm. Why would he want Elena dead? Why would he want Ethan dead? Mara set down the instrument she was holding and turned to face him for the first time in 2 hours. Because 7 years ago, she said, there were 2 candidates for the throne. The direct bloodline, your father's line, and the collateral line, through your father's brother. Dorian went very still. Lord Cavan's mother was your great-uncle's eldest daughter, Mara said, which makes him, in the collateral count, 3rd in succession after you and Ethan. The words landed in the room like stones in still water. 3rd, Dorian repeated. With Elna gone, and Ethan gone, she said quietly, and depending on what happened to you in the aftermath of grief and instability, the path becomes considerably shorter. Dorian stood. He did not pace. He did not reach for anything. He simply stood very still in the middle of the room and looked at a point somewhere past her shoulder. How long have you known this? He said. The connection to the succession. I worked it out tonight. She held his gaze. The poisoning of the Queen. I have known since I saw her blood. I have known, and I have been silent for 7 years, because I had no proof, no stand-in, and a very clear memory of what happened the last time I said something. You were afraid, he said. Yes, she said simply. I was afraid. I am still afraid. I am choosing to speak anyway, which I hope counts for something. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, How much longer? 2 more hours. After that, the compound will be neutralized. He will need to rest, real rest, several days of it, and he cannot consume anything that has passed through Cavan's household management until the man is removed. He will be removed, Dorian said. She believed him. She turned back to the table and picked up her work again. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Dorian said, The charges against you. Yes. You treated a member of the royal family without authorization. I did. And fled the scene of a royal emergency. I did that too. And trespassed on crown lands. She glanced back over her shoulder. My cottage has been on the edge of that marsh for 10 years. The Crown's survey maps are apparently not current. He said nothing. I understand, she said, turning back, that the sentence stands unless you choose otherwise. I am not arguing my case. I am simply finishing what I came here to do. The fire crackled. Why did you leave? He said. The Institute. When they took your credentials. You could have fought it. I tried. And I was very clearly shown the limits of what one person could accomplish against a coordinated institutional effort. She paused. So I left. And I built a different life. And I was largely at peace with it, until a boy in a ravine smelled like gray seep, and I lost my mind entirely. You could have let him die, Dorian said. No one would have known you were there. I would have known. He did not respond to that. 2 hours passed in the particular silence of a room where something serious was happening, and both people in it understood it. At just past 4 in the morning, Mara stepped back from the table and set down the last instrument. She looked at Eaton for a long moment. It is done, she said. Before you find out what Dorian does next, and what happens to Lord Cavan, and whether Mara walks out of that palace or not, make sure you are subscribed. Click the subscribe button below this video, and hit the bell, so you do not miss what comes next. This story is just getting to the part that matters. Chapter 5. The morning after. Eaton opened his eyes at dawn. The light was the pale, uncertain kind that comes before full morning, gray and uncommitted, falling through the narrow window of the treatment room in a single thin bar. He lay very still for a moment, cataloging his own condition, the way young alphas are trained to, assessing strength, breath, the quality of the silence around him. Then he turned his head and found his father sitting in the chair beside the bed. Not asleep. Just sitting there watching him, in the way Dorian watched things, with that absolute focused attention that meant he had been there a long time. Father, Eaton said. Good morning, Dorian said. Eaton looked past him. There was a woman across the room, sitting at the table with her back to them both, writing something in a small bound journal. Her shoulders were set with the particular posture of a person who was choosing to give them privacy by focusing very hard on something else. That is the woman from the ravine, Eaton said. Yes. I heard her. Eaton's voice was still rough. Before I lost consciousness, she told me I had been poisoned. She was correct. She also told me to show someone my blood and ask about something called gray seep. Across the room, the woman's pen stopped moving. She did not turn around. I heard her, Eaton repeated, and I tried to tell the palace healers, but I did not have the right words, and they thought I was confused from the fall. I know, Dorian said. She saved my life, Eaton said. Yes. Twice, Eaton said. Once in the ravine, and once because she told you what she knew, even when it would have been safer not to. Dorian was quiet for a moment. Yes. Eaton looked at his father with those 2 old eyes and said, What are you going to do? Dorian stood. He walked to the table and set his hand on the edge of it, not touching Mara but close, and waited until she turned to look at him. She did, her face carefully neutral, the journal open in front of her. Lord Cavan, he said, was arrested 2 hours ago. His chambers are being searched. His correspondence is being examined. He paused. The chief physician Crest is being located. He retired to his family estate 3 years ago. He will be located. Mara said nothing. Your credentials, Dorian said, were revoked by an institutional process that was, at the very least, influenced by men who had reasons to silence you. That process will be reviewed. He met her eyes. I cannot promise the outcome of a formal review. What I can promise is that it will be conducted fairly, by people who are not connected to Cavan. She looked at him for a long time. And the sentence, she said. Vacated, he said. The charges against you were as follows. First, unauthorized contact with a royal. You made contact with a member of the royal family who was dying and saved his life. Whatever authorization means, it does not mean leaving a child to die in a ravine. He held her gaze. Second, fleeing the scene of a royal emergency. You stabilized the patient, gave critical information to a semi-conscious boy, and retreated when you heard the search party coming, because you were a woman with a revoked credential who had just performed a procedure without legal standing, and had every reason to believe the consequences would be severe. He paused. I have some understanding of making difficult choices under impossible circumstances. She was very still. Third, he said, almost to himself, the matter of the survey maps. I will have them updated. Something moved across Mara's face. It was not quite a smile. It was the shadow of one, brief and involuntary, gone almost before it appeared. And in exchange for all of this, she said. Nothing, he said. You already did the thing I needed. You do not owe me anything further. She looked at him for a long moment, assessing him the way she assessed everything, with that precise, unhurried attention. I am not good at courts, she said. I have never been. I say the wrong things at the wrong times, and I do not know how to want things quietly, and I have a significant tendency to be right in ways that inconvenience powerful people. I had noticed, Dorian said. I am telling you this, she said, because you are about to have a very significant problem. Cavan will not have been working alone. Men like Cavan never are. There will be threads to pull, and they will lead to places you do not want them to lead. And the process of pulling them will be ugly and complicated, and it will require someone who understands how Grey Seep works, and who administered it, and how to document the evidence in a way that cannot be challenged. Someone like you, he said. Someone exactly like me, she said, which I am raising not as an offer, but as an observation. She met his eyes, and he met hers, and in the quiet of the early morning room, they were both acutely aware that they were, against all reasonable expectation, speaking to each other as equals. Stay, he said. Not an order, not a royal command, just a word. She looked at him for a long time. Chapter 6. What the evidence revealed. The investigation took 6 weeks. Mara ran it from a set of rooms in the East Wing that Dorian gave her, the reinstated title of Senior Investigative Physician, stamped on the document by the royal seal, so that no one could question her authority or her access. She had a team, 3 junior healers, who were competent and careful, and had not been in the palace long enough to be entangled in anything. What they found over those 6 weeks was worse than she had told Dorian it would be. Not because she had been wrong in her assessment of Cavan's guilt. That was as straightforward as she had expected. The correspondence in his chambers was damning, deliberately obscured, but not obscured by someone who truly believed they would ever need to hide it from someone who knew what they were looking for. Cavan had been arrogant. Most men like him were. The worst part was the scope. Cavan had not been working alone. He had been working with a consortium of 5 noble houses who had collectively decided, 7 years ago, that the bloodline represented by Dorian and his son was an obstacle to a redistribution of power that would benefit them enormously. The Queen had been the first step. Eaton was meant to be the second. His death arranged to look like the accumulated effects of the fall, and Dorian was meant to follow in the grief and political instability that would result. It was a plan that had been in motion for 7 years. It had been derailed by a woman in a marsh cottage who had not quite been able to walk away from a dying boy. Mara laid the completed report on Dorian's desk on a Thursday morning in late winter and stepped back and watched him read it. He read the entire thing, every page. He was a man who read things thoroughly, and she had known this and written accordingly, every claim sourced, every thread documented to its endpoint. He set the final page down and sat looking at the wall for a while. "The 5 houses," he said, "all documented. The evidence is sufficient for formal proceedings. Crest. He has provided a full account in exchange for reduced charges. Everything he told me was consistent with what I already knew. His testimony, combined with the physical evidence, is sufficient." Dorian nodded slowly. "Elena," he said, "that one name. Again, just that." "There is nothing in the evidence that will bring her back," Mara said quietly. "I know that. I am sorry. I am sorry I could not do more at the time. I am sorry that I was afraid." He looked at her. "You were not the one who poisoned her," he said. "You were not the one who covered it. You were the one who told the truth when everyone with power was telling you to be silent, and you paid a significant price for it. And you told the truth again when it cost you even more." He paused. "I owe you an apology." She blinked. "I sentenced you to death," he said, "based on 30 seconds of observation, and a set of charges designed to sound worse than they were. I made a decision without adequate information, because I was angry, and because trusting people has not gone well for me, and because I had already decided what you were before you opened your mouth." She said nothing. "That was wrong," he said. "I was wrong." The room was very quiet. "Your Majesty," she said carefully. "Dorian," he said. She looked at him. "My name," he said. "You can use it. You have been in my palace for 6 weeks. You have sat across tables from me for hours at a time, and you still call me your Majesty, as though we have never spoken. It begins to feel pointed." She was quiet for a moment. "Dorian," she said. The words sat between them differently than any formal address had. "I should go," she said. "The marsh will need tending. The herbs will be a disaster." "Probably," he said. She gathered the notes she had brought and straightened them and did not leave. He did not ask her to. "Etan asks about you," he said, "regularly. He has been lobbying for the past 3 weeks to have your position made permanent. He is 17, she said. He lobbies for everything." "He is usually right," Dorian said. "I mentioned that." She looked at the report on his desk, and then at the window, and then at him. "A permanent position would require me to live here," she said. "Yes, in the palace. There is space," he said. "The East Wing rooms are yours if you want them. They have a better garden than the marsh. Considerably less damp." She looked at him. This careful and enormous man who had sentenced her to death, and then sat beside his son's bed all night, and said I was wrong with the same steadiness he applied to everything. "I am still not good at courts," she said. "I am aware," he said. The court will survive. She thought about the marsh cottage, the silence, the particular quality of light, the life she had built out of smaller pieces after the larger one fell apart. She had loved that life. She had needed it. She thought about a boy in a ravine with death in his blood, and the choice she had made in 40 minutes that had upended everything. She thought about 6 weeks sitting across a table from a man who read every page and said I was wrong and meant it. The garden, she said, is it south-facing? I believe so, he said. Gray seep antidote requires direct southern light for 2 of its component herbs, she said. If we are going to have any hope of keeping a supply on hand for future emergencies, which I would strongly recommend given recent events, the garden needs to be south-facing. He looked at her for a moment. I will have someone check, he said. Today. She nodded. She picked up her notes. She still did not leave. The hearing for the 5 houses, she said. It will be contested. Their lawyers are excellent, and the documentation, while thorough, will be challenged on several technical points that I have already identified. I will want to be present. Of course, he said, and Cavan's sentencing. I have opinions about the appropriate charge structure that I would like the opportunity to formally submit. I would expect nothing less, he said. She looked at him one more time. This man she had walked toward in a dungeon, with nothing to offer, except the truth and the willingness to speak it. Dorian, she said, and the words still sat differently. Mara, he said. She left, but she left toward the east wing, not the gate. And in the morning, when Eaton found her in the garden checking the orientation of the light, he said absolutely nothing except, Good. I was tired of lobbying. She looked at him sideways. How is your arm? Better, he said. Father is different. Is he? He laughs more. Eaton looked at her with those perceptive, too old eyes. Not more often. He laughed exactly once, but it was a real one. She turned back to the garden and assessed the angle of the winter sun on the stone. South-facing, she said. Good. He also argued with me for 40 minutes this morning about a drainage policy, Eaton said, which was completely normal. But then at the end he said I had a point, which was not normal at all. People change, she said. People change when something changes them, Eaton said. He shrugged in the particular way of 17-year-olds who knew more than they were going to say directly. The south herbs will grow well here. The wall keeps the wind off. She looked at the wall. He was right. Go eat your breakfast, she said. I already did, he said. I lobbied for yours to be brought out here. It should arrive in about... He glanced back toward the palace. Now. A young kitchen maid appeared in the garden doorway with a tray. Mara looked at the tray, and then at Etan. You are exactly as much trouble as your father says you are, she said. He grinned, broad and sudden, and entirely unlike a king's son, and entirely like himself. And she thought, yes, worth saving. Absolutely worth every single thing it cost. She sat on the cold stone bench in the winter garden and ate her breakfast in the south-facing light. Above her, from a window on the upper floor, she felt, without looking up, the particular quality of attention she had come to recognize over 6 weeks of sitting across tables and speaking the truth, and staying when leaving would have been easier. She did not look up, but she did not look away. Some things did not need to be said to be understood. And in the palace that had tried to silence her, in the garden where the light fell exactly right, Mara finished her tea and began planning the spring planting. She had a great deal to grow. She had, it turned out, a great deal to stay for. The end. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Stories like this one take real work, and your support means everything. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the channel right now and turn on notifications so you are always the first to know when a new story drops. And if this one moved you, leave a comment below telling me your favorite moment. I read every single one. See you in the next story. Epilogue. 6 months later. The formal proceedings against the 5 houses took 4 months. Mara was present for every session. She sat at the table assigned to the Crown's investigative team, which meant she sat 3 rows behind Dorian and slightly to his left, and she watched him work in the way she had come to understand was distinctly his. Without theatrics, without visible emotion, with a methodical precision that was, she had concluded, the most formidable thing about him, in a long list of formidable things. He was not the kind of man who crushed his opponents. He was the kind of man who built an argument so thorough and so correctly evidenced that opposition simply became untenable. One by one, the legal challenges collapsed. One by one, the defense positions were withdrawn. The lawyers were excellent, as she had predicted. They were simply not working with as much truth as she was. Cavan was convicted on 12 counts. Crest provided his full testimony and received a reduced sentence, lifetime revocation of his credentials, and permanent exile from the capital. Mira had argued for this outcome. She had not forgiven him, but she understood that his usefulness as a witness was more important than her personal satisfaction. She told Dorian this. He looked at her for a moment and said, "I know." He had come to say that more often, not as a dismissal, as a recognition. The East Wing rooms were everything she needed. She had not expected that. She had expected to miss the marsh, the silence, the fog. She had expected to lie awake in the palace feeling the walls pressing in. Instead, she slept better than she had in years. She did not examine that too closely. The permanent position had been formally established in the 2nd week of her stay. Senior court physician, with expanded mandate to include investigative medicine and training of junior healers. The document was very thorough and covered a number of jurisdictional questions that had apparently been causing difficulty for Dorian's administrative staff. She had read it carefully and suggested 3 amendments. He accepted all 3 without argument, which she found faintly suspicious. She told him so. He said, "You were right about all 3. She said, "That is not the point. The point is that you accepted them without argument. You argue with Eaton for 40 minutes about drainage policy." He looked at her with something in his eyes that she had been carefully not naming for 6 months. "Etan is frequently wrong," he said. "You are rarely wrong. It is efficient." She gave him a very level look. He held it for exactly the right amount of time, and then glanced down at his desk. "There are 17 documents here," he said, "that require signatures before tomorrow morning." "Then you should sign them," she said. "There is also," he said, still looking at the desk, "a proposal being drafted by the Administrative Council regarding the formal status of senior court positions and the benefits that attach to them." She waited. "One of those positions," he said, still not looking at her, "currently has a somewhat ambiguous standing in terms of the relevant protocols." "Mine," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. He looked at the desk. "Dorian," she said. He looked up. If there is something you want to say, she said, I would prefer you say it. I have spent 10 years not saying things I should have said, and I find it does not go well over time. He was quiet for a moment. I have been attempting to approach this correctly, he said. There are protocols, appropriate distances, a number of relevant considerations regarding the nature of your position and mine, and the implications of certain— Dorian, she said again. He stopped. Say it plainly, she said. He looked at her, directly, with that complete and focused attention. I would like you to stay, he said. Not as a physician, as— He paused. I am aware that this is complicated. I am aware that I sentenced you to death approximately 9 months ago, which is not an ideal starting point. I am aware that you value your independence and your work, and that you did not come here for any reason, except that you could not leave a dying child in a ravine. I am not asking you to change any of those things. She waited. I am simply, he said, asking you to consider that some of the reasons you might have for leaving are not as urgent as they were, and some of the reasons to stay are— Dorian, she said very quietly. He stopped again. She looked at him for a long moment. The south garden, she said, needs a second planting bed on the western side, for the shade preference compounds. I have been meaning to request the additional space for 3 months. He looked at her. If I am going to be here long term, she said, I will need it. He was very still for a moment. Then something in his face changed. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would have been visible to the court or the council or anyone observing from a distance. Just a small shift, like a door opening on a room that had been closed for a very long time. I will have it arranged, he said. Good, she said. She picked up the pen from his desk. Give me the documents, she said. I will tell you which ones are genuinely urgent and which ones your administrative staff has mislabeled to create pressure. He looked at her. She looked back. He slid the stack across the desk, and she began sorting them, quickly and efficiently, into 2 piles. He watched her work. Outside the window, winter was finally giving up its hold on the capital. The light was changing, gaining warmth and length, the particular quality of early spring when the world remembered what it was capable of producing. In the south garden, the gray seep antidote components were showing their first growth. Etan had reported this to both of them separately, apparently under the impression that neither of them knew. He was 17, and occasionally a disaster, but he was alive, which was the important thing, and he was himself, which was the other important thing, and he was sitting right now in his own rooms, arguing with a tutor about something with exactly the energy of a boy who had not spent a single day of his life believing he was dying. Mira sorted the last document and pushed 1 pile toward Dorian. Those need signatures by tomorrow, she said. Those do not need them until next week, regardless of what the dates say. I have marked the ones with errors that should be corrected before you sign. He looked at the marked documents. All of them? He said. Administrative staff is thorough, but occasionally optimistic about word choice, she said. None of the errors are large. 2 of them are actually improvements. I have noted which. He looked at her over the stack of documents. Mara, he said. She looked up. The west side of the south garden, he said, should have enough space for whatever you need. She held his gaze. Thank you, she said. Thank you, he said. For the boy in the ravine. The fire crackled. Outside, the spring was continuing without their supervision. Inside, two people who had each lost a great deal and rebuilt from the remaining pieces sat across a desk from each other and said very little about the most important things, because some things did not need to be said to have already been decided. The documents got signed. The proposals got drafted. The west planting bed was measured and cleared by the following Thursday. And if anyone in the palace noticed that the king smiled differently in meetings, and that the senior court physician no longer sat 3 rows behind him, but rather at the same table, slightly to his right, they said nothing about it. Or rather, they said a great many things about it, but only to each other, and mostly with a kind of satisfaction, which was, all things considered, the right response. Some things, after all, went well. Some things, after all, were worth the trouble they cost to reach. The south garden grew, the herbs grew well, and the palace, which had tried very hard to be a place of endings, found itself becoming, unexpectedly, and without anyone planning it, a place where something was beginning. Mara stood in the early morning light, with her hands in the soil, and thought about a marsh cottage with a leaking roof, and a woman who had decided to be invisible, because being visible had gone so badly the first time. She looked at the palace walls around her. She looked at the spring light. She pressed her palms into the good dark earth and thought, yes, yes, this will do. This will do very well. Additional chapter. The things that were said in the garden. 3 weeks after the formal proceedings concluded, Eaton found Mara in the east garden, at the particular hour she was always there, just past sunrise, when the light was still soft, and the palace had not yet started demanding things from everyone inside it. He was carrying 2 cups of tea, and had the expression of a young man who had prepared what he intended to say, and was hoping it was not going to be awkward. It was probably going to be slightly awkward. She looked at the cups, and then at him, and said nothing. He sat down on the bench beside her, and handed her one of the cups, and stared at the herb beds for a moment. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "properly. Not the formal version I gave at the court session, which my father wrote half of. The actual version." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "You are welcome. Properly. I heard you in the ravine," he said. "Even at the edge of it. I heard you telling me what to look for. I tried." He paused. "They did not listen." "No, but you tried. I should have been louder." "You were 17 and poisoned," she said. "You were louder than most people manage." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother," he said, and stopped. She waited. "My father told me," Eaton said, "what you found, about the gray seep in her blood, what Crest told you, and what happened after." He looked at the garden. He did not go into detail, but he told me the broad shape of it. "Yes," she said. "She died thinking she was simply ill," Eaton said. "She never knew." "No, she did not know." Mara considered this carefully. "I am not certain whether that is a mercy or not. I have gone back and forth on it for 7 years." He thought about this with the seriousness he brought to things, when he forgot he was supposed to be nonchalant. "I think it is a mercy," he said finally. "She did not have to carry the knowledge. She just got to be sick, and then not be sick anymore. That is simpler. That is one way to hold it," she said. "My father holds it differently," Eaton said. "Your father holds most things differently." Eaton gave her a look sideways. "He holds them correctly now, at least. Or more correctly. The people around him are better." He paused. "You are better." She looked into her cup. He was good before, Eaton said, fair to the last. He was always good. He was just alone in it, doing the right thing by himself in a room, which is harder than it sounds. He glanced at her. Having someone who does the right thing alongside you changes the quality of the doing. She looked at the herb beds. You are quite wise for 17, she said. I have been told, he said. By yourself, mostly, she said. He grinned. And one or two others. Recently. He finished his tea. He does not say things directly. You have probably noticed. I have noticed, she said. But he means them, Eaton said. The things he does not say. He means them more than most people mean the things they do say. That is simply his construction. He stood and took her empty cup. I thought it was useful information to have. She looked up at him. He was tall. He was going to be taller. He had his father's jaw, and something about the set of his eyes that she thought was probably his mother. And he was standing in the early morning light, looking like exactly what he was. A good person who had almost not gotten to finish becoming one. Thank you for the tea, she said. Thank you for being here, he said. Both times, and all the times in between. He went back inside. She sat in the garden and listened to the palace wake around her. In 3 hours, she had a meeting with the junior healers about their training curriculum. In 5, she had a working session with Dorian on the documentation framework for the ongoing proceedings. In the evening, there was a formal dinner she was supposed to attend, which she had been managing to avoid for 6 weeks, on the grounds that she had things to do, and which she had run out of plausible reasons to avoid. She was not, she had concluded, actually trying to avoid it. She was simply not entirely certain what to do with the version of herself that sat at formal dinners in palaces beside kings, after 10 years of being the woman in the marsh cottage who grew herbs and helped farmers and deliberately took up as little space as possible. She was learning. She found it was not as difficult as she had anticipated. The space the palace offered was not the kind that crushed you. It was the kind that waited to see what you needed and then provided it without fanfare. Good equipment, good light, people who did their work and did not need to be managed or directed or convinced. And one man who said things in the particular way of someone who had been alone with his meaning for a long time and was figuring out, cautiously and carefully, that it did not have to stay that way. She stood up from the bench. She had work to do. She was finding, always more work to do, which was fine, which was better than fine, which was the kind of fullness that came from being somewhere you were genuinely needed and knowing that you would not be leaving. She walked back into the palace. In the upper corridor, she passed Dorian coming down from his morning briefing, surrounded by 3 advisors, all talking at once. He met her eyes over their heads. She raised an eyebrow in a way that said, "Are all of those actually urgent?" He made a very small, pained expression that said, "At least 2 of them are not." She tilted her head in the direction of his study, in a way that said, "I will be there in 20 minutes if you survive." Something shifted in his face that said a number of things she was still cataloging. She continued to the east wing. He extracted himself from the advisors. And in the palace that had tried to silence her, in the life she had not expected to find herself living, Mara went about her morning with the particular quality of contentment that belongs to people who have come through something very difficult and arrived somewhere they had not planned but recognize, immediately, and without question, as home. The garden grew. The spring advanced. Some things, it turned out, were that simple. Some things were not simple at all, and cost everything and were still, entirely and completely worth it. She had the rest of her life to discover which was which. She found, with some surprise and a great deal of relief, that she was looking forward to it. Final note from the garden. The west planting bed was finished on a Friday. Mara stood over it with a trowel and assessed the drainage and the orientation and the depth of the soil preparation, and found it satisfactory. More than satisfactory. She knelt and pressed her palm into the earth and felt the temperature of it, the particular warmth that meant good structure, that meant things planted here would have what they needed. Behind her, she heard boots on stone and did not need to turn around. Dorian stood at the edge of the garden and looked at the new bed and then at her. The gardeners had questions, he said, about the spacing requirements. I gave them the diagrams. They had questions about the diagrams. She looked back over her shoulder. What kind of questions? Whether they were required to follow them exactly, or whether there was room for interpretation. There is not room for interpretation, she said. The spacing is determined by root competition and access to light. It is not aesthetic preference. I told them that. And they were relieved, he said. Apparently, when instructions come with reasons attached, people find them easier to follow. She stood and dusted her hands on her work trousers. That is true of most things, she said. Yes, he said. He was standing in the spring light, with his formal morning completed, and the afternoon not yet begun. And he looked, she thought, like a man who had just taken a full breath after a long time of not quite managing one. She had a tendency to notice things like that. It was occupational. She had been noticing things like that her entire adult life. The particular quality of someone's posture when something had shifted internally. The small tells that said, something is different now. Something has settled. She was very good at reading those things in other people. She was, she acknowledged, considerably less practiced at reading them in herself. But she thought, yes, something has settled. She looked at the new planting bed. She looked at the palace walls around the garden. She looked at the spring light on the stone, and the herbs already established in the south bed, and the long growing season ahead. She thought about gray seep antidote, and what it required, and what it gave back. She thought about a boy in a ravine who had cost her everything, and given her back more than she had lost. She looked at Dorian. He was looking at her. The afternoon meeting, she said. The curriculum review. We are still scheduled for the 3rd hour. Yes, he said. I will have notes. I assumed, he said. A bird moved through the garden, quick and purposeful, and was gone. She picked up her trowel and her notes and walked past him toward the doorway. She stopped in the doorway. Dorian, she said, without turning around. Yes, he said. Thank you for the garden. A pause. Thank you, he said, for staying to use it. She went inside. The palace received her in the way it had learned to, without ceremony, with simple utility, with the particular quality of a place that had understood what she was and made room accordingly. She had work to do. She was glad of it. She was glad of all of it. That, she had decided, was enough. That was, in fact, everything.